would you please repeat not only who you are, but in which university you are working?
Yeah, I work as an associate professor at Teachers College, Columbia University.
Your name is?
My name is Srikala Naraian.
Mm-hmm. What you doing in the University of Columbia?
Yeah, I, like I said, I'm an associate professor in the Department of Curriculum and Teaching, and I direct the program direct the elementary and secondary inclusive education programs in the college. They're both teacher education programs.
Thank you, that's great. I need those information just to break the ice, because my English is awful, but I think we will get 20 minutes. It's will be okay, hopefully. You've written a book. Mm-hmm. Which title was it? Your newest book.
Yeah, that's
Inclusion.
Teaching for Inclusion.
Teaching for Inclusion.
And the second bit of it, which I don't like very much, it says 8 principles for inclusive practice, or for something, 8 principles for effective and equitable practice.
Okay.
It was not my idea to have that title, so
sometimes in life we have to do.
We make compromises. Thank you. I
exactly.
absolutely agree. So that was a compromise.
What was not your compromise?
What was
the other one? Exactly. What did you freely?
The first part of the title, Teaching for
exactly.
Inclusion, was yes, that was mine, because it is something that I'm passionate about, and the book itself, it builds on all the research I've done with teachers. So in a sense, it values the experiences of teachers in schools rather than just academics. So I try to develop an understanding of inclusion from the ground up rather from the top down.
Okay.
That's fine. That's why Teaching for Inclusion is important.
I had a short interview with Professor Tony Booth, and I asked him a question: what is inclusion from the perspective of participation? And I mentioned 2 words: top down and bottom up. Exactly what you've done now.
Right.
And he said to me, for Tony Booth, there is nothing. Top down and bottom up.
Yeah.
He wouldn't use these or those
terms.
Terms. What do you mean by bottom up and top down?
I mean, it's an idea and a concept. So yes, I agree. It doesn't have to be top down or bottom up, but in the real world, it gets translated as, this is inclusion, you have to do it.
Okay.
And that's a top-down directive.
Okay.
So the people who are actually engaged in the work of articulating, enacting inclusion, are given that. If they don't come with that mindset already, then it becomes a top-down directive.
Okay.
If you get the buy-in of everybody in the school, for example, then it becomes a collective journey. And in that case, it's not a top-down or a bottom-up. Okay. In the schools where I have studied, when I said it's a ground-up, it was like, I want to understand inclusion as in what sense does it make to the people who are actually doing it, not just the people who are making the policy or who are doing the research on it. Okay. And so that's kind of what I meant by the ground up. It's a ground-up theorizing of inclusion.
Why not? That's great, thank you.
Yeah.
You've mentioned 2 very important words. The other words are very important. I would like to understand what you mean. Articulating. And acting.
Acting. So I'm trying to shy away or move away from this idea of implementation. Because implementation, almost suggests, here's something that's given to you, now you have to go do it. It's a very linear process, right? But when you think about articulation, it's like inclusion, in your school is going to look differently from inclusion in your school, because, the context in your school may be totally different. It's a different set of kids, a different set of resources, a different set of teachers. So how collectively everybody articulates inclusion or enacts inclusion is going to look very different from, say, in your school, where you have a different set of kids and teachers and resources. So that idea of articulation that allows for the possibility that there are so many different factors that go into enacting inclusion, and we need to take that seriously.
I ask you this question because in this lecture today, before you come in the seminar room, we discussed the term culture.
Culture.
And that's what are you saying now? Mm-hmm. I felt as if you said the same thing. Right. What I was now less than minutes trying to explain, because we did say that culture is not something collectives, which a lot of people think maybe politically, but also articulating and acting in many aspects. Yeah. Is that okay?
Yeah, it's practice.
Okay, it's
culture
practice.
Is also, there are forms of practices.
That's great.
And so it's, people, the scholars have written, like Barbara Rogoff and others have talked about culture as repertoires of practice. So you bring a bunch of different repertoires of practice and you take them, you enact them differently in different contexts. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, I totally agree with you. Inclusivity is a form of cultural practice.
Okay. Even people would have a hidden agenda with culture. Yeah. That's very dangerous. We leave it there, okay?
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
No, a lot of students ask me to put some questions. Yeah. And so I'm going to look on my paper just to be just to other students and ask them. And the first one was, did you visit primary schools in Germany?
I visited a Gesamtschule. I visited, I'm going to visit a Realschule on Friday. And the last time I was here, I visited the Laborschule.
Ah, okay.
So they're not primary. I mean, like Laborschule, it could be is a primary. It's a different kind of Schule.
Exactly.
Right. But the Gesamtschule is not a primary school. Yeah, and neither will be the Realschule that I go to.
Did you notice any other focuses than in USA in between? In respect of inclusion?
Well, I know that inclusion in the German school system is quite different because it starts from a different place. Mm-hmm. You have this very formal system of tracking students right at the time they're 10 years old. And this whole idea of the Hauptschule, the Realschule, and the Gymnasium itself is a form of tracking. And so you're tracking by ability. Somebody, depending on their intellectual, physical, whatever their ability, they can go to one of these schools or they go to the Förderschule. So that is a formalized system of tracking that doesn't exist in the US. Now, in the US, people still do tracking informally within classrooms or within a school, but it's not so formalized as it is over here. And that is what I think... the idea that there's very limited mobility between one type of schule and the other, that works against this concept of inclusion. So in some ways, the very structure of the German school system, it makes it harder to enact or articulate this idea of inclusion. There are other issues, of course, in the U.S., and that if you don't have this formalized system, we have other other kinds of systemic factors that lead to exclusionary forms of practices. So I was saying, for example, many of the schooling systems, not in the urban areas, but in the suburban areas, there's funding for school is tied to the taxes people pay on their homes. So if you live in a very well-to-do or affluent neighborhood, and your taxes are higher, that means there's more money going into the school system, and then you have better resources for the school. So that then creates almost, again, inequality between that kind of neighborhood and a different kind of neighborhood where, where there's not, the property values are not so high, where taxes are less, and then schools get less money to fund, to sort of run, to operate. So that itself creates inequality, and then poor resources can create, unequal educational experiences between kids. It exacerbates, the inequalities between children and between society, between groups in society. Yeah. So lots of parallels and lots of differences too.
That's great, thank you.
Yeah.
In your book, the introduction, I think, I've learned something. What did you done with the first research? You mentioned you choose both expression interchangeably. people with disability
Yeah.
or disabled people.
Right.
Could you please give me a distinction between
them? Yeah. The reason I came into it, or the entry for me into inclusion was through disability rights movement. That was how I came to understand the significance of inclusion. And within the disability rights movement, the disability rights movement is deeply connected to scholarship also in the same area of disability, and that's called disability studies. So disability studies exists as a separate body of work that thinks about disability not as a problem, not as a deficit, but as something that happens in the interaction between people and society. So, for example, I don't know if, without trying to, take too many liberties here, I'm going to say if you were in a context where there were no elevators or no ramps, then your disability then becomes much more is different than when there are ramps or when there are elevators, or when it is easier for you to access building, right? So it's about accessibility too, and so I think so. What I've come to understand is that disability is just a normal part of human variation, and so we don't medicalize it, and we think in terms about the fact that disability can only be understood in relation to ability. As long as we talk about abilities, there'll always be some people whom we call disabled. So it's just showing that connection. And the reason I say all of that is to answer the question about, when you refer to people as people with disabilities or disabled people, you can do it in both ways. And I think it's how people claim their disability identity. So some people would argue that they are, disabled, that if you say people with, individual with disability, then you are privileging or giving more emphasis to the idea of the person, and the disability is almost like something separate. It's almost like a minus the disability. Let's add it on afterwards. Whereas, and so that becomes a person with the disability. So you're privileging a normal person first before saying, oh, it's also a disability, right? So there is that meaning with an individual of individual with disabilities. Other people, and oftentimes people who are intellectually disabled and have had to really fight for their rights in society in sort of different ways than people with physical disabilities. They have often said, we are people first, so don't think of us as we are people first. So in that sense, that descriptor, individual disabilities, makes sense. For other people who the word disability is a political identity category. It's like, it sort of establishes that disability is, means something, has meant something historically, and has come about because of the ways in which the environment, the social and the physical environment, has constructed this experience. So people, oftentimes many people with disabilities, and I don't mean to tell you all this, you probably already know this, Faraj.
I need this for my students and other people who will hopefully show our videos.
Okay.
That's great, because I asked our mayor of Bielefeld why he distinguished between people
with disabilities
and the other one. And the first expression you mentioned, he's also 100%. But you say it in English, he said it in German.
Right.
He would like to put the person at first and then the other.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
And so and not everybody agrees that that's a good way to do it. And to say disabled person means to embrace disability as part of a person's identity, and you can't separate.
So we can do, as you do, interchangeable.
Yes.
I think your decision is okay for you, not only for other people.
Yeah.
That's great.
Okay.
I'm going to quote you in 2 questions, and we're still in your book also. what does inclusion mean in the lived experiences of teachers as they go about implementing things, abstract concept, or these abstract concept? This is one of your quote from the book.
Yeah. So what is it? And I think that's the whole premise of the book, is to understand that as people, teachers, enact this concept of inclusion in everyday teaching, everyday pedagogy, from the time the children are in the classroom, to the ways they talk to them, to the kinds of ways they plan the curriculum, to the worksheets they design, to the kinds of experiences they provide in the classroom. All of that, everything, we can scrutinize it to say, is it inclusive or is it not? And so if you think about what a high standard that is for teachers, it almost makes it impossible to always and to do it right all the time, right? So teachers make compromises. They have to be strategic, and they don't only work with abstract notions of what is equitable and right. They also have to deal with what is my administration telling me I have to get done before the end of the day. They're also dealing with what does this parent want that doesn't seem to mesh with my idea of equity, but this is what the family wants. So I have to make sure that happens as well. It also has to do with how much money do I have to be able to get these additional resources that can help everybody. So all of these questions are part of the lived experiences of teachers who are trying to enact this inclusion. So my research has been about when I look at those lived experiences, then inclusion then emerges in many different ways, and in how and what is, by what standard are we going to assess, scrutinize them? That's the question I have.
That's great. The other quote also from you, and that will be not the last, but one of the last questions. How can such lived experiences meanings advance the field of inclusive education?
And I think that's the project that I'm currently working on here too in Bielefeld with Bettina is if we are going to go ground up, and if we think about these lived experiences and we recognize the compromises, the strategies, the negotiations that teachers are doing with this idea of inclusion, then we have to rethink what it is that we even mean by it. Because otherwise because there's so much that they do that doesn't quite fit neatly with this ideal notion of what inclusive schooling should look like. If we applied only that standard, then everything that teachers do, you could either see it as hopelessly failing, or my God, they are just amazing success stories, and these teachers are somehow have some, are bravely fighting something and being able to resist, the administration, or resist the rules or whatever. But it shows teachers either as heroic or as being very deficient. And that's what. But if we rethink inclusion to recognize also that it is a process, that it's something that is going to look different in different contexts, then that way we allow teachers then to be able to articulate in ways that make most sense in their own context, but it also means that we need to come up with a different way of thinking about inclusion.
That's great. Thank you for summing up. But the last question, I'm not going to leave you go without the last question. It's not from the students, from myself. You mentioned a lot of words which are very important also to my work. Have you got personal experiences as a teacher?
Yes.
So, this is the last question. If you are not a teacher, if you are a minister, and you have got a lot of power, what would you like to change at first step in the schools or the education system? Not only in the schools, maybe in the diversity opening, something like in universities. What is in your mind?
I didn't get the second part.
Not only
in the
education school, but also education general, and particularly in universities.
At the universities.
What kind of diversity or inclusion should be let me call it diversity policies, implementing this one?
Yeah, I mean, to start off the second one, I mean, we haven't talked about inclusion or at the higher education level. And there's a lot of literature, research that's been done on what we call ableism in higher education. Is that a term that your students are familiar with?
Not yet, but
so ableism, this idea that, that somebody who's disabled is inferior to somebody who's not. So it's also a form of discrimination. Just as you have racism and sexism, you also have ableism. And if you think about higher education, university setting, it's so premised on ableist ideas. We sort people, and we give, value and prize those who achieve. Think about all the people who are doing fabulous research, all the monies they're getting. It's all about, it's all ableist in terms of, how it is set up. So there is that, but there's also that in terms of, how students with disabilities, how they experience higher education on campus and what impact that has on the ways the administration makes its policy. So the point is, yes, ableism exists on higher education campuses. And I think, one of the things that I'm trying to do within my own institution is simply bring awareness of disability as also part of this conversation around difference.
How do you do this?
It's, you try and get elected to a committee at the administrative level. And then and that's where I am right now.
That's okay.
To try and, bring about more awareness among faculty so that the pedagogies in the classroom can also reflect awareness of different ways of learning and different forms of being in the world, like different ability structures. So that's the higher education, certainly. And in schools, what would I do as a minister? I mean, I don't think you want it to be a top-down directive. I think that's where I hear about what happened in North Rhine-Westphalia. There was a rise and fall of inclusion. It was a top-down directive. So clearly that didn't work, right? And so, but there is some, I think it has to be in tandem with, collective buy-in and so thinking of schools as places for inquiry, where everybody, gets to sort of be able to understand why this is being taken up, but also recognizing that we need to take a stand. I mean, it's not just like, you can't just have inclusion. When I say inquiry and have everybody buy in, some people are never going to buy in. I mean, there's fundamentally, some people will simply say, I think, people who are disabled should not be in this setting. And, the question then is, how are you going to invest time and money and resource to change their mindset, which is shifting mindsets, important work, but you can only go so far. And at some point, you simply have to make that commitment and that stand that says that, this is what equity means and go from there.
It's a great word, because I have to tell you something before I say thank you. We've been doing something like diversity policies or diversity opening, not only in the university, here in Bielefeld, in Germany, and we deal with such problems. Kind of resource, power, other. I don't name them or able them as a problem, but I would like to say challenges. That's what the great challenges, if you think about work with, and not only with disabled people or people of disability, a general work in everyday life, but particularly at universities and education system in general, and all other files. Assistant Professor Carla, I'm going so to Carla. Associate, sorry.
That's okay.
Professor Srikala Naraian, thank you. And I hope I'm going to watch this interview with you, with my students, not only those who are now here, but with the other in the future. Thank you very much for having me.
You're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me.